May 1st, 1945. Hamburg radio interrupted its programming at 10:30 in the evening. Solemn music played, then an announcer's voice. It is reported from the Führer's headquarters that our Führer, Adolf Hitler, has fallen this afternoon at his command post in the Reich Chancellery, fighting to the last breath against Bolshevism and for Germany. The words echoed across what remained of the Reich. In bunkers and basements, in field headquarters and prison camps, in columns of retreating soldiers and pockets of trapped units, German generals heard the news. What they said in response would reveal everything about the Wehrmacht's relationship with the man who had led them to this catastrophe. But the radio announcement was a lie. Hitler had not fallen fighting. He had put a pistol in his mouth and pulled the trigger 36 hours earlier after poisoning his new wife and his dog. And the reactions of Germany's military leadership to his death would be far more complex than the regime's propaganda could ever acknowledge. The first to know were those closest to the bunker itself. Wilhelm Keitel, 63, chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, had spent the final days in the bunker complex, watching Hitler deteriorate. The man who had once clicked his heels and barked, "Jawohl, mein Führer," to every order now witnessed something else entirely. On the afternoon of April 30th, Keitel stood in the corridor outside Hitler's study. He heard the shot. The sound was muffled by the concrete walls and the heavy door, but unmistakable. His face went white. An SS guard opened the door minutes later, and Keitel saw the bodies. Hitler slumped on the sofa, blood running from his temple, Eva Braun beside him, the smell of bitter almonds from the cyanide mixing with gunpowder. Keitel said nothing at first. He stared at the scene, his hands trembling at his sides. Then he turned and walked to another room, where he sat down heavily in a chair. An aide found him there 20 minutes later, still silent, staring at the wall. When the aide asked if he was all right, Keitel looked up. His eyes were wet. "It's over," he said. Just those two words. Then he stood up, straightened his uniform, and went to find Alfred Jodl. Jodl, 55, chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, received the news from Keitel in person. They stood in a small office in the bunker complex, maps of the collapsing fronts spread across the table between them. Keitel told him directly, "The Führer is dead. He shot himself." Jodl's reaction was different from Keitel's. He showed no emotion at all. He looked at the maps, then back at Keitel. "When?" he asked. "About an hour ago." Jodl nodded slowly. He picked up a pencil and made a small mark on one of the maps, noting the time. Then he said something that would be remembered by those who heard it. "Now we can make decisions like soldiers again." The statement hung in the air. Keitel stared at him. Jodl met his gaze without flinching. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that Hitler's military interference had been a disaster, that his refusal to allow retreats had cost hundreds of thousands of lives, that his strategic delusions had made victory impossible. But even now, even with Hitler dead, neither man would take the obvious step. Neither would order an immediate surrender. The conditioning ran too deep, the machinery of obedience too well oiled. They would continue the fight for another week, sending men to die for a regime that no longer had a head. 50 miles north, Karl Dönitz, 53 Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, sat in his headquarters at Plön. He had no idea Hitler was dead. He was reviewing reports of U-boat positions when a radio operator handed him a message at 11:45 that night. It was from Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary. "Grand Admiral Dönitz, the Führer has appointed you, Herr Grand Admiral, as his successor in place of Reich Marshal Göring. Written authority follows. You are hereby authorized to take any measures which the present situation demands." Dönitz read it 3 times. His face showed confusion, then shock. He turned to his aide. "What does this mean? Is the Führer dead?" The message didn't say. It was deliberately vague. Dönitz spent the next hour trying to get clarification through radio channels, but communications were chaos. The Reich was fragmenting. Finally, another message arrived. Hitler had fallen that afternoon, fighting at his post. Dönitz believed it. He stood and addressed his staff, his voice formal and controlled. The Führer has fallen. He died a hero's death in Berlin, defending the Reich to his last breath. His sacrifice calls us to continue the fight against Bolshevism. But even as he spoke the words, something in his expression suggested doubt. One of his aides, Walter Lüder-Neurath, would later recall that Dönitz looked like a man who had just inherited a burning house and was being told he had to save the furniture. The truth about Hitler's suicide wouldn't reach Dönitz for another 2 days. When it did, his reaction was telling. According to Lüder-Neurath, Dönitz went pale, then red, then pale again. He sat down at his desk and put his head in his hands. When he looked up, he said, "So he lied to us at the end, too." But Dönitz would maintain the fiction of Hitler's heroic death in his public statements, even as he worked frantically to negotiate Germany's surrender. The propaganda mattered more than the truth, even now. 300 miles west, in a prisoner of war camp in England, a very different conversation was taking place. The British had been holding high-ranking German officers at Trent Park, a mansion in North London, since 1942. The prisoners didn't know that every room was bugged, that hidden microphones captured every word they said. On the evening of May 1st, guards brought newspapers into the common room. The headlines announced Hitler's death. The British intelligence officers monitoring the microphones leaned forward in their listening posts, pens ready. What would these generals say when they thought no one was listening? General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, 54, captured in North Africa, in 1942, read the announcement first. He set down the newspaper and looked at the other prisoners. "Well," he said, "that's that then." General Ludwig Cruel, 53, also captured in North Africa, picked up the paper. He read silently for a moment, then laughed, a short, bitter sound. Fighting to the last breath. Of course that's what they'd say. The truth would be too embarrassing. "You think he shot himself?" von Thoma asked. Without question, the man was a coward at heart. All that screaming and table-pounding was compensation. Cruel tossed the paper aside. "The question is, how many more have to die before his generals admit it's over?" Another officer, General Heinrich Eberbach, 49, captured in France in 1944, spoke up. "Some of them will never admit it. They'll fight until there's nothing left to fight with, because admitting defeat means admitting they were wrong about everything." The conversation continued for hours. The transcripts, declassified decades later, reveal a remarkable candor. These generals, freed from the need to maintain the public fiction, spoke openly about Hitler's military incompetence, his refusal to listen to professional advice, his disastrous interference in operational decisions. Von Thoma said at one point, "When I heard about Stalingrad, I knew it was over. Not because we lost an army, we could have rebuilt that, but because it showed that Hitler would rather let hundreds of thousands die than admit a mistake. That's when I knew Germany was doomed." Cruel agreed. The tragedy is that so many good soldiers followed him anyway. They knew better, but they followed. We all did. He paused. "That's what I can't forgive myself for." The British officers listening in their hidden room took notes furiously. These weren't the reactions of fanatical Nazis. These were professional soldiers grappling with the realization that they had served a regime that destroyed their country. But not all the generals in British captivity felt the same way. In another camp, General Dietrich von Choltitz, 50, the former commander of Paris, heard the news differently. According to camp records, his first words were, "Now they'll blame everything on him." But we all knew. We all knew what was happening, and we did it anyway. Von Choltitz had famously refused Hitler's order to destroy Paris. before surrendering it. Now, with Hitler dead, he seemed to be wrestling with a different question. How much responsibility did the generals bear for following orders they knew were wrong? Far to the east, in Soviet captivity, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus heard the news in his prison cell in Moscow. Paulus, 64, had surrendered the 6th Army at Stalingrad in February 1943, becoming the first German field marshal ever captured. Since then, he'd been kept in isolation, interrogated extensively, and eventually convinced to make anti-Nazi broadcasts. When Soviet officers told him Hitler was dead, Paulus showed no visible emotion. He simply nodded. But that evening, he asked for paper and pen. He wrote a statement that the Soviets would later publish. Hitler's death removes the last obstacle to ending this senseless war. Every German soldier who continues fighting now is not defending Germany. He is only adding to her destruction. The statement was calculated, crafted to serve Soviet propaganda purposes, but those who knew Paulus said it also reflected genuine conviction. He had turned against Hitler after Stalingrad, after Hitler had refused to allow the 6th Army to break out when escape was still possible, after 250,000 men had been sacrificed for Hitler's refusal to admit tactical error. Paulus's aide, Colonel Wilhelm Adam, was in the same facility. His reaction to Hitler's death was more visceral. According to Soviet records, when told the news, Adam stood up from his chair so quickly he knocked it over. He walked to the window and stood there for several minutes, his back to the room. When he turned around, tears were running down his face. "All those men," he said, "all those men at Stalingrad. They died because he wouldn't let them retreat. And now he takes the coward's way out while they're still rotting in the snow." The Soviet officers present didn't know how to respond. They had expected triumph, perhaps relief. Instead, they were witnessing something more complex, a kind of rage mixed with grief, the anger of a soldier who had watched his comrades die for nothing. Back in Germany, the news was spreading through the fragmenting Wehrmacht. In Bavaria, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, 59, Commander-in-Chief West, received word on May 2nd. He was in the middle of negotiating the surrender of German forces in Italy. When an aide brought him the radio announcement, Kesselring read it without comment. Then he asked, "Is it confirmed?" "Yes, Herr Feldmarschall. Multiple sources." Kesselring folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He turned back to his maps. "It changes nothing about our situation here. We continue the negotiations." But later that evening, alone in his quarters, Kesselring sat at his desk and wrote in his diary. The entry, discovered after the war, was revealing, "The Führer is dead. I feel I should write something profound about this moment, but I find I have no profound thoughts. Only a kind of numbness and a question, how did we let it come to this?" In Czechoslovakia, Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, 52, commander of Army Group Center, received the news on May 2nd as well. His reaction was the opposite of Kesselring's contemplation. Schörner, known for his fanatical loyalty and brutal discipline, refused to believe it. "Lies," he told his staff. "British propaganda. The Führer lives." His officers exchanged glances but said nothing. They had learned not to contradict Schörner. He had men shot for defeatism regularly. Even now, with Germany collapsing, he maintained iron discipline through terror. But over the next 2 days, as confirmation piled up, even Schörner had to accept reality. When he finally did, his response was to continue fighting anyway. He issued orders to his troops. "The Führer is dead, but the fight continues. We hold our positions. Any man who retreats will be executed." Thousands more would die in Schörner's sector before he finally surrendered on May 8th. He would be the last German field marshal to lay down arms, and he would do so only after personally fleeing to Austria, abandoning his troops, trying to escape in civilian clothes. He was captured by Americans on May 18th, still insisting he had done his duty. In Berlin, in the bunker complex, the generals who remained were dealing with more immediate problems. General Hans Krebs, 57, Hitler's last chief of the Army General Staff, had been present when Hitler died. He had watched the body being carried up the stairs, watched it being doused with gasoline in the garden, watched it burn. Now, on May 1st, Krebs was sent to negotiate with the Soviets. He crossed the lines under a white flag and met with Soviet General Vasily Chuikov. Krebs informed Chuikov that Hitler was dead and tried to negotiate a ceasefire. Chuikov's response was blunt: unconditional surrender only. Krebs returned to the bunker and reported this to Goebbels and Bormann. They refused. Krebs, exhausted and despairing, realized the end had come. On May 2nd, as Soviet forces closed in on the bunker, Krebs shot himself. His last words to an aide were, "I cannot survive this shame." The shame he meant wasn't Germany's defeat. It was his own complicity in Hitler's military disasters, his own failure to stand up to the madness. He had known better, and he had obeyed anyway. General Helmuth Weidling, 55, commander of Berlin's defense, survived longer. On May 2nd, after Krebs's death, Weidling ordered the remaining Berlin garrison to break out or surrender. He himself surrendered to the Soviets that afternoon. In his initial interrogation, when Soviet officers asked him about Hitler's death, Weidling said, "I felt relief. Not joy, not sadness, just relief." It meant the decisions would finally make military sense again. He paused, then added, though by then, of course, there were no military decisions left to make. Weidling would die in Soviet captivity in 1955, never having returned to Germany. In the West, other generals were already in American and British custody. General Alfred Jodl would travel to Reims on May 7th to sign the unconditional surrender of all German forces. When American officers asked him about his reaction to Hitler's death, Jodl gave a carefully measured response. It was the end of an era. Germany must now look to the future. But in private, Jodl was less diplomatic. According to American intelligence reports, he told fellow prisoners, "Hitler destroyed Germany. We helped him do it. That's the truth we'll all have to live with." Jodl would be hanged at Nuremberg in 1946, convicted of war crimes. Keitel would hang beside him, convicted of the same crimes. In their final statements, neither mentioned Hitler by name. Some generals managed to avoid capture entirely, at least initially. General Heinz Guderian, 56, the pioneering tank commander, had been dismissed by Hitler on March 28th after a final confrontation. When Hitler died, Guderian was in Bavaria, trying to stay ahead of the advancing Americans. He surrendered on May 10th. When interrogated about Hitler's death, Guderian's response was cold. "I stopped caring about Hitler's fate when he stopped listening to military reality. The man was a disaster as a strategist. His death changed nothing. The disaster was already complete." Guderian would write memoirs after the war, carefully positioning himself as a professional soldier who had merely followed orders. The memoirs mentioned Hitler's death in passing, with no emotional content whatsoever. In Norway, General Franz Böhmer, 57, commander of German forces there, heard the news on May 2nd. Norway was isolated, cut off, the war already lost. Böhmer called his senior officers together and read them the radio announcement. Then he said, "Gentlemen, we will surrender honorably. No more German soldiers will die for nothing in Norway." It was a remarkable statement, an explicit acknowledgement that continuing to fight would be dying for nothing. Böhm arranged the surrender of his forces over the following week, but the weight of what he had been part of would prove too much. On May 27th, after being arrested for war crimes related to operations in Yugoslavia, Böhmer jumped from a third-floor window in Nuremberg. He died instantly. The variety of reactions revealed something important. There was no single German general response to Hitler's death. These men had different relationships with Hitler, different levels of complicity, different moments when they had realized the war was lost. Some, like Jodl and Keitel, had enabled Hitler until the very end, and their reactions mixed relief with guilt. Some, like the generals at Trent Park, had been out of the picture long enough to gain perspective. Some, like Paulus, had turned against Hitler after personal betrayal. Some, like Schörner, remained fanatical even after Hitler's death. But almost all of them, in their private moments, expressed a version of the same realization. They had known better, and they had followed anyway. They had been professional soldiers who had allowed themselves to be led by an amateur with delusions of military genius. They had watched him make catastrophic decisions and had said nothing, or had said something and then obeyed when overruled. The question of why haunted many of them for the rest of their lives. General Siegfried Westphal, 51, Chief of Staff to Kesselring, tried to answer it in his post-war memoirs. We told ourselves we were soldiers, that politics wasn't our concern, that our duty was to obey. But that was a lie, we told ourselves. We knew what was happening. We knew the regime was criminal. We knew the war was lost, but we continued because stopping would have meant admitting we had been wrong from the beginning. In the days after Hitler's death, as Germany's surrender unfolded in pieces, the generals found themselves in a strange position. The man they had served was dead. The regime was collapsing, but the army, what remained of it, still existed. They had to decide what to do with that remnant. Some, like Dönitz, tried to maintain some kind of government, negotiating surrender terms, trying to save what could be saved. Some, like Schörner, kept fighting pointlessly. Some, like Weidling, simply accepted reality and surrendered. Some, like Böhmer, couldn't live with what they had done. The reactions to Hitler's death were, in essence, reactions to the realization of their own failure. Not just military failure, the loss of the war, but moral failure. They had served evil, and they had known it was evil, and they had served anyway. General Erich von Manstein, 57, perhaps Germany's most talented field commander, was already in British captivity when Hitler died. His reaction, recorded by British intelligence, was characteristically analytical. Hitler's death is irrelevant to Germany's situation. The war was lost 2 years ago. The only question since then has been how many more would die before we admitted it. When pressed about his own role, von Manstein became defensive. I was a soldier. I fought as well as I could with what I was given. The political decisions were not mine to make. But the interrogator pushed back. You knew about the atrocities. You knew about the camps. You knew the war was criminal. Von Manstein's response, recorded in the transcript, was telling. What was I supposed to do? Refuse orders? Stage a coup? One man cannot change the course of history. The interrogator wrote in his notes, subject appears to genuinely believe this, has convinced himself that individual responsibility doesn't exist within a military hierarchy. Remarkable capacity for self-deception. This capacity for self-deception was perhaps the most common reaction among German generals to Hitler's death. Faced with the reality of what they had enabled, many of them retreated into the fiction that they had been merely following orders, that they had no choice, that they bore no responsibility. But some couldn't maintain that fiction. General Friedrich Olbricht, 57, had been executed by firing squad in July 1944 for his role in the plot to assassinate Hitler. He wasn't alive to hear of Hitler's death, but his final words before execution were recorded. I did what I could. I wish I'd done it sooner. The generals who had participated in the July 20th plot, those who survived, heard of Hitler's death with complex emotions. General Ludwig Beck had shot himself after the plot failed. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg had been executed immediately. But some conspirators had escaped detection. General Erich Höppner, 67, had been arrested, tried, and hanged in August 1944. His last letter to his family, written before execution, included this line: "When Hitler finally dies, remember that some of us tried to stop him. Remember that not all German officers were cowards." When Hitler did die, 9 months later, Hoepner's family read that letter again. His widow told Allied interrogators, "My husband would have felt vindicated, but also angry. Angry that it took so long, that so many more died in those 9 months." The reactions of German generals to Hitler's death ultimately revealed the tragedy of the Wehrmacht, an institution of professional soldiers who had allowed themselves to be corrupted by a criminal regime, who had enabled atrocities in the name of duty, who had known better but had acted worse. Some of them, in their final moments or their post-war reflections, acknowledged this. Most did not. Most retreated into the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the fiction that they had been honorable soldiers fighting an honorable war, that the crimes were committed by others, that they bore no responsibility. But the reactions in those first hours and days after Hitler's death, before the self-justifications hardened into place, revealed the truth. The relief, the numbness, the guilt, the anger, the desperate attempts to maintain the fiction of heroic death, all of it showed that these men knew exactly what they had done. They had followed a madman to the destruction of their country. They had enabled crimes of unprecedented scale. They had sent millions to die for nothing. And when that madman finally died, their reactions ranged from relief to continued fanaticism, from honest reckoning to elaborate self-deception. But almost none of them could claim surprise. They had known all along how this would end. Hitler's death was simply the confirmation of what they had known for years, that they had bet everything on a losing hand, and that history would judge them for it. The question that haunted the best of them, the ones capable of honest reflection, was simple. Why had they followed so long? Why had they obeyed when they knew better? Why had they enabled evil when they could have resisted? General Henning von Treschow, 52, had participated in the July 20th plot and shot himself when it failed. Before his death, he told a fellow officer, "The world will condemn us, but I believe history will judge that we at least tried." When Hitler died, von Treschow was 9 months dead himself. But his question remained, hanging over all the surviving generals. What would history say about those who tried to stop Hitler, and what would it say about those who followed him to the end? The reactions to Hitler's death provided the beginning of an answer. Those who felt relief, who acknowledged the disaster, who accepted responsibility, they at least showed some capacity for moral reckoning. Those who continued the fight, who maintained the fiction, who blamed others, they revealed themselves as beyond redemption. In the end, Hitler's death changed nothing about Germany's military situation. The war was already lost, but it revealed everything about the men who had led Germany's armies. In their reactions to his death, they showed the world exactly who